This is my third time in Israel, so I see some of my students here, so it's actually very exciting to be back here. I haven't been traveling since the pandemic, so it's been a while before I actually go on an international trip. So when we talk about data, we always say that data is the new oil, except in Texas. We're still thinking about all the old oil. So I framed this presentation in the intellectual property context, but I think it's very important for us to also think about how they apply to data, because a lot of things when we talk about right to research will cover not just protected works under intellectual property law, but also data and other information resources. So when we think about the right to research, I think there are different ways we can implement the right to research. And I think a very good starting point for those of us who are coming from the US is always fair use. And I think it's actually a very good place to be here in Israel, because fair use also is a very important issue. And when I go to civil law countries, it takes me a little bit more time to explain the different concepts, especially how open-ended the arrangement is. So there are a number of countries that have been very active in introducing fair use or fair use-like provision in their jurisdiction. And I happen to be joining NIFA in a lot of different events talking about how to transplant fair use, whether it's working or not. And this one is actually taken from a video that's available on YouTube. So for any of you who are interested, it's organized by American University, and you can find the talk right there. It's basically about how to globalize fair use. But there are also other jurisdictions that offer exceptions based on to help people to do text and data mining, right? So that is increasingly popular, and we have that, for example, within the European Union. In the Digital Single Market Directive, you'll be able to find provisions with respect to text and data mining. Singapore, a number of other jurisdictions have also been very active in trying to push for the type of protection. I think some have some variants in terms of what they do. So, for example, Japan has a very different approach than what we get from the EU. So it's actually quite interesting to see how text and data mining have been implemented in different places. This has become quite important, especially when we think about the context of artificial intelligence or machine learning. I think in the last 6 months or so, when you go to a tech conference, it's almost impossible to avoid mentioning ChatGPT, right? So there was actually 1 month where I go to every single conference, we end up ditching the topic and start talking about ChatGPT, just because everybody wants to weigh in on what's going on there. And so I think that will come up later on in the presentation as well. So when we think about the right to research, there are different ways you can think of it. One is basically a limitation exception. It's more on the negative side. But you can also think of it more on the positive side. It's more an affirmative right that will help you to actually have access, that will help you to do research. It's similar to some countries like Canada when they talk about user rights, right? So it's more on the affirmative side. It's not just a limitation exception. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to actually see if we can actually bring together some of the discussion within the context of intellectual property and human rights and apply into a right to science context. So one way to think of this is to locate the human right basis of the right to research. Another way to do is to actually look at whether we have any tensions between right to research and intellectual property and human rights. So a good starting point, obviously, is the right that's the most relevant to intellectual property, and that's Article 27.2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's the right to protect the interests resulting from intellectual productions. And this one is actually the basis for a lot of protection you get within intellectual property law. It's not so much about the right to research. But it's important to think of this as a way to build up a framework for both intellectual property and human rights. So on the slide here, that includes a number of articles I've written about how to actually build up the entire framework on intellectual property and human rights. And at the very top, you can see that there's basically it's an elongated circle in green color, talk about limitation. That's basically a very good way to show that it's not just about the different level like production, interest, and protection, but you also need to think about limitation. And I think this actually will be quite important when we think about right to research. So if you go to some of the interpretive comment about this particular right, they talk about how the right will enable authors to enjoy an adequate standard of living. It doesn't say that you need to, the right allows you to maximize your profit. Right? It allows you to enjoy standard of living. That means there's limitation as to how far you go, especially when there are tensions with other human rights. So one way I do here is to actually look at that particular right as both a grant of power as well as a limitation, similar to what we get in some of the cases like Graham v. John Deere in the US. We always talk about how the intellectual property clause within the Constitution is both a grant as well as a limitation. And to some extent, we can also look at it that way. Another right that is frequently mentioned in the right to science context or right to research context is the right to education. It's a very important issue. And it's important because right to education will actually help develop the informed citizenry so that they can do science, they can do a lot of different things, and that's why it's very useful. So I was trying to write about that in the educational context, and I find out that it's actually under-researched except when you talk about limitation and exception. When you talk about fair use for educational materials, when you talk about access to knowledge, there are enough materials about the right to education. But beyond that, it's actually underexplored. So any of you who are graduate students, who are students looking for paper topic in undergraduate, think about how to link intellectual property together, the right to education. It's actually a very interesting topic, but that's highly underexplored by commentators. What I want to focus in the remainder of the presentation is about the right to science. And the reason why I want to go in that direction is that the interpretive comment was adopted during the pandemic. And so there are a lot of interesting developments going on, and it was actually quite surprising to a lot of us in both directions. One is that it's surprising that it actually came out during the pandemic. It's understandable because of the need for vaccines, diagnostic, treatment. That's why it came out around that time. But still, it's surprising that they were able to put together the whole thing just within that time frame when things are just so difficult. But it's also surprising for us because we had the first interpretive comment on the right to protect intellectual interests in 2006. And then we have the interpretive comment for the right to take part in cultural life in 2009. And then we waited for more than a decade and thinking that they're actually not going to work on this comment, and they eventually came out during the pandemic. So what the interpretive statement says is that there are 3 different human rights impacts we can find based on the strong protection of intellectual property rights. The first one is that IP rights will distort the funding for scientific research. Those research that is going to have commercial benefits tend to get more support. Those that are important but not necessarily provide a lot of commercial benefits will not get as much support. The second thing is that IP rights tend to limit the sharing of information on scientific research. If you write something, you might not be able to share with the colleagues due to IP rights. And if you want to actually have access of what has been published, it can be very expensive. Think about all the journal subscription. Even the very top university in the US, they have a tough time figuring out how many of those journals they can still subscribe to. And we continuously have the discussion of if there are enough libraries subscribing to certain journals, maybe we can actually do some exchange. We don't need to all subscribe to those journals at the same time. So it's, imagine that would happen in the developing countries where they actually have very limited resources to do all the subscription. And the third impact is that it poses significant obstacles to those people who want to access the benefits of scientific progress. And we have seen this in the pandemic context with respect to vaccines, with respect to treatment. Even if you have come up with the vaccine, you have come up with the treatment, a lot of people may still not be able to access to what has been created. There are different key takeaways we can get from the interpretive statement. And the interpretive statement is actually useful because it's an authoritative interpretation by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So to the extent we want to find meaning with respect to those words within the international covenant, we rely on that type of interpretation. I want to highlight here 3 different takeaways. The first one is that doing science does not only concern scientific professionals, but also includes citizen science. Right? There's a tendency when we think about text and data mining, or we think about other exceptions, we want to limit to only research institutions. we want to limit to only certain people who believe are professional scientists. But the reality is doing science can be anybody who wants to be involved because you want to learn, you want to engage with it. It's important for you to actually develop the faculties so that you can do more science. So, and I think this is actually quite effective in trying to get the point across that it's not just limited to a certain segment of the population, but for everybody. If you go back to the origin of the international human rights instruments, you can see that there was a big debate as to whether everybody can actually do science. Right, so at the very top you have the delegate from Cuba saying that not everyone was sufficiently gifted to play a part in scientific advancement. And then at the bottom you get Rene Cassin, who has been very active in drafting a lot of provisions within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He said that even if all persons could not play an equal part in scientific progress, they should be able to participate in the benefits derived from it. Right, so you can see that the right to science is for everybody, and by extension we can also make an argument right to research should be for everybody. This is Farida Shahid, who is the special rapporteur on the economic and social and cultural rights. And what she says is actually very helpful. Human development is about participation. It cannot be just about access to benefits or the products of scientific advances. Right? The important thing is that you actually get involved in the scientific process and trying to do science. The second takeaway with respect to interpretive comment is that the right to science is an empowerment right. It helps you realize other rights within human rights. And so what it says here is that the right to science has an instrumental value as it constitutes an essential tool for realization of other economic, social, and cultural rights. And this is also quite useful as well. The benefits of scientific progress are not restricted to material benefits and products of scientific advancement, but include the development of the critical mind and faculties associated with doing science. Right? So that will give you some idea of how we want to make sure that you have the capacity, you have the ability, and then you can actually use it to realize other human rights. And so when you put them together, you can actually think of it, there's a passive aspect and there's the active aspect. The active aspect is to do more science. The passive aspect is to be able to enjoy the fruits of the scientific advancement. And the third one, which I want to share with you, is about positive recommendation. In the interest of time, I think a very good way to deal with this one is to actually break it down by giving you examples. The first one is about copyright limitations and exceptions, and that is something that's tied to what I mentioned earlier on about fair use, text and data mining, and other exceptions. So what the comment says is that state parties should not only abstain from interfering in the freedom to develop science, but must also take positive steps. So there's an affirmative role for state to do. What do they need to do? There are two different things. One is advancement of science, development of science. The second one is dissemination of scientific knowledge about technological diffusion. Right? Both of them are affirmative obligations for the states to do under the interpretation. The statement also talks about how states should provide adequate financial support for research, and I think that's very important. And we have seen what happened during the pandemic when governments actually play important roles in trying to be active, providing resources, and I think that would be quite important. States could also resort to other incentives which delay remuneration of successful research from future sales. Examples would be grants, subsidies, something that is not attached to the way you actually sell the product. So if you get a grant to develop some vaccine, it does not matter how many you sell or how many you need to produce, because you already get it upfront so that you can do the production. The statement also talks about the importance of maintaining balance between IP and open access and sharing of scientific knowledge. And so there are a lot of interesting models about how to promote open access, and this will incorporate some of the discussion right there. Now, the second example I want to share with you is about the pandemic. We've just gone through at least 2 years of very difficult period with respect to what's going on there. And I think right to science is actually quite relevant to this discussion. So during the height of the pandemic, there was some discussion about whether the provisions of the TRIPS agreement, which is the International IP Treaty, can be waived so that we can help combat COVID-19. And one of the strongest arguments that we made by both commentators and other supporters from the NGO community is that we need to allow people to have the freedom to operate. For vaccine, it might be much more difficult, which it requires a lot of technical knowledge. But for making things like ventilators, PPE, right? Sometimes it's just IP standing in the way, you'll be able to actually have more freedom to operate, and you'll be able to make adaptation. So I think this will be quite relevant when we think more about local innovation as we go forward. I think it will also be useful when we think about how to actually transfer or have more technological diffusion within a lot of countries. And that ties back into what I said early on with respect to empowerment right, because the right to science will actually help realize the right to health, so they're interconnected. And the last thing I want to end on is about artificial intelligence and machine learning. As I mentioned earlier on, this year it's almost impossible for us to avoid any discussion about ChatGPT. So in the statement, they also talk about limitations. This is actually not too helpful for those people who are strong advocates of the right to research. Right? What it says is that some limitations might be necessary. The reason why we need limitations is because we want to guarantee the safety and quality of the products used by persons, right? And if you go back to the origin of a lot of the human rights treaties, it's basically about people creating those crazy scientific experiments. And now we're concerned about killer robots, right? So we want to make sure that they will not actually play with artificial intelligence to a point that they're going to affect human beings, not just about how they actually do their regular life, but also about their human rights. And we have seen countries trying to ban ChatGPT, although Italy banned it, and then they allow it to do it again, so it's only temporary. But I think the important takeaway here is that, yes, we need to have limitation, but what about those who actually want to learn about how to incorporate artificial intelligence? This article just came out earlier this week. It talks about how some students say, please do not assume the worst of us. We might actually want to use ChatGPT, we might want to use AI in our research, right? Teach us how to actually do better. And I think that would be quite important. So a lot of the things here is not just about intellectual property or even data laws or information law. It's actually much broader than that, especially when you think about the limitations. So the final thing I want to share with you is some bonus thoughts. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we always think about how to separate the works created by humans from the works created by machines. But the bigger issue is actually this one: creative input or intervention from a human author. So I tend to believe that in the future, we're going to be in a world where human and machines will coexist for at least a few decades. So there will be a lot of interaction with respect to how they're going to create the work and interact with each other. And so I'll end on these two slides. The first one is that it will be a while before we get robots that can create on their own, which is true, right? It'll take a while. But should copyright law change if the creative human input is only 10% or 20%? That might be not just a difference in degree, but a difference in kind, to the point that we actually need to change our copyright system. And if we're going to create with humans, or if robots are going to create with humans, what does it mean for the right to research? Right, so that is something that we can think about. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.